there, welcome to this algebra tutorial. Today we're going to talk about factor by grouping. So factor by grouping works when you have a polynomial with four different terms, just like this, that are all set equal to 0. So the first step is to check to see, what do my first two terms have in common? Well, in this case, these two terms both have an x squared. And then we check, what do my last two terms have in common? Well, they're both divisible by 2, 4, and 8. And I want to pick the greatest common factor that they have. So I'm going to choose 8. So what I do is I come over here and I start by factoring out an x squared because that's what they both had in common. Now what I'm left with, once I factor it out of those, just the first two terms, I'm left with y minus 3. Now, like I said, both of these two terms are both divisible by 8. But what's key in factor by grouping is that what is left over in parentheses must match. So in order to get a minus 3, I actually need to factor out a negative 8. If I factored out a positive 8 and wrote this as plus 8, this would leave me with negative y in the parentheses, when in fact I need a positive y. And then when I take positive 24 divided by negative 8, that leaves me with a negative 3. And then we have what we need. What's inside these parentheses, in fact, matches. And like I said, what's inside these parentheses when you do factor by grouping must match. If it doesn't, go back and check to see if you're off by a negative sign somewhere. And then this next step is very important. You take what is outside of the parentheses and you group them together, just like so. We have x squared minus 8. And then you take what's inside of the parentheses and you set that right next to it as a factor. And now we've grouped together our factors, hence the term factor by grouping. And so what's really neat about this is from here, we can actually solve each term individually. And so what I do is I set both of them separately equal to 0, just like we would if we were factoring a normal way. And so I add 8 to both sides, I get x squared equals 8, and then when I take the square root, remember, I do have to add a little plus or minus guy up here, and so I end up with x equals plus or minus the square root of 8, which does then factor down or split into the square root of, 2 times the square root of 2. And then I come back up here and I finish this out. I set y minus 3 equals to 0. I add 3 to both sides, and then I can go ahead and get my answer. I have y equals 3. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that I go back into my original equation. So this is my x right here. I have two possibilities for x, a positive 2 root 2 and a negative 2 root 2. And I have one possibility for y. And I check them in my original equation, and as long as they all work, meaning they equal to 0, then those are in fact solutions of my polynomial. And there you have it, factor by grouping. See if you can find some more examples to practice this skill, and keep this in mind whenever you have a 4-term polynomial. Good luck!